All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Sam Buckhalter. I'm a Microsoft Compliance Technical Specialist here. And what we wanted to do was start off a little bit of a series deep diving into some of the compliance components. So every once in a while, you might see me pop into these sessions and we'll kind of take this to the next step or bring other components in. But today we wanted to kind of do intro to the basics and kind of take it back to the beginning and go through a little bit about what Microsoft Information Protection is, and then how to start thinking and about deploying it and kind of what that looks like in your environment. So I guess looking back last year, we've had kind of a big rush for security. A lot of our customers, a lot of schools, they have taken that deep dive to prevent phishing campaigns, preventing ransomware. And that's been a big core of the focus. And really getting into that data security and data protection component is kind of where we're looking at going in the future. And so data is exploding everywhere we are, whether it's in the Microsoft cloud or out in Google or Box or AWS. It's structured data, unstructured data, across devices, across clouds, across platforms, and being able to get a grasp on that all up. So for today, our objectives is really to cover a few things. Talk a little bit about Microsoft Information Protection, what it is, what it means. Look kind of at our deployment framework, that crawl, walk, run type methodology of kind of getting a grasp on your data and where to start and where to go. And then sharing, really effectively a demo. So I want to get out of PowerPoint pretty quick here and actually walk through some of the configuration, some of the workflows, some of the dashboards on what to look out for and where to spend your time in the environment. So with that, what is Microsoft Information Protection? And the thing here is it's not actually a product, it's a suite of products. So MIP, or Microsoft Information Protection, it's kind of branding. It's encompassing things like our sensitivity information types and our sensitivity labels and data loss prevention and Azure Information Protection and all of these other acronyms here. And the easy way to think of it is data loss prevention, AIP. What do they mean? How do they interact with one another? And they're really complementary to each other. So data loss prevention, I like to think of that as protecting your data in transit. So when a user is taking an action, whether they're sending an email or sharing a file from OneDrive, it's identifying that type of data, that sensitivity of data, and taking an action upon that to protect that content when that action occurs, so in transit. Azure Information Protection, that's at the file level. So kind of think of that as data at rest as well as data at creation. So you're protecting that file and its contents no matter where it goes. So as you create a new file and might have sensitive information in it. It's protecting that, putting the right permissions, encrypting where it needs to be encrypted, and then further also preventing that from being sent or exfiltrated in ways that you may or may not want to allow. So they tie hand in hand. You can create DLP policies that tie into labels and prevent oversharing of content, for example. So data loss prevention, easy way to think about that is data in transit. Azure Information Protection, good way to think about that is data at creation, it's file level, or data at rest, where you're scanning your repositories to look at what kind of content you have. So with that, first off, just kind of setting the scope here. This is really looking at your content as you start managing and governing your data across all platforms, whether that's on premises, in file shares, or maybe an old on-prem SharePoint repository. It's managing that within the Office apps themselves. So this is the ability to be able to apply labels, whether you're in a Windows system or you're in the web office or the web interface, or even on your Mac or iOS and Android type clients, being able to appropriately label and classify information there. It's targeting SharePoint sites and Teams and Office 365 groups and applying protection at the group site level for your content. It's looking at your data in Exchange. Again, whether that's just natively in an email or an attachment, or looking at old messages that might have existed that had sensitive information in them. We have our SharePoint Online applying labels, encryption, protection to files in SharePoint document libraries or your own personal OneDrive, and taking appropriate protections from sharing those outside of the scope that content belongs. And then the last part is the non-Microsoft apps. And so we do that with something called Microsoft Cloud App Security. It's our CASB solution, if you're not familiar with it. But this is how you can apply this unified labeling platform outside of Microsoft. You can apply these labels into the Googles and Dropboxes of the world to expand that protection in a unified approach cross-platform outside of just the Microsoft infrastructure. So from here, I wanted to talk a little bit about deployment framework. It can be daunting. Where do you start? How do you do all of this without impacting your users? And so we've broken that down into a handful of steps, really starting out with crawl, walk, run. And so crawl is where you start that journey. It's where you start making those doing the analysis of the environment to see what kind of data is out there, what are we obligated to protect, what are the use case scenarios of who we need to be able to efficiently share content with while still be protected but not impact our workflow. So in the crawl stage, there's a couple great simple items you can kind of kick off. And so really it starts around discovery. You can deploy your scanner in discovery mode. You can deploy that for on-prem to go look at those file shares, your on-prem data repositories. You can look at the content out there in SharePoint and OneDrive and Exchange mailboxes and get a handle on the data you're most frequently seeing in your environment and where some of your highest risk areas might be. Second, it's great to get started by creating your first labels. Doesn't have to be perfect, but get a few labels out there. Make them broadly applicable. They don't have to do encryption. They don't have to impose restrictions, but start publishing those labels, getting end users familiar with them and labeling content appropriately. And it starts that campaign, education campaign to those end users. So they'll see those labels. They can start manually labeling and classifying documents as appropriate. You can also apply a default label so that all of your documents have some sort of protection on them. That could just be something as simple as your general label. You can also start doing things like data loss prevention pop-ups. These are our little safety tips so that it'll pop up in Outlook on the web and showing you, hey, or even just in your Office apps, hey, we've detected a certain amount of content. Just want to warn you that you might want to protect this a little bit more, just to begin that education process for users. What this is doing, this is helping you set the stage, identifying what's unknown in your environment, where you might want to apply that sensitivity label and that protection in the future, and where you want to build out and further scope those policies. It's also going to prevent a little bit of accidental sharing. You're educating those users. You're giving them pop-ups. You're preventing some of that core ignorance of sharing data beyond its scope of appropriate scope of access. Minimal impact to the end users. You're not enforcing any major policies. You're giving them pop-ups, and you're making them make decisions when they're taking sharing actions. The next stage would be that walk stage. How can you get a little bit more proactive and protect against your data leaving the environment? And so with that, we want to start looking at things like introducing encryption. Find the most sensitive data in your environment. It might be something simple as credit card numbers and social security numbers, and identifying that data and applying encryption, applying labels to those for when that's being identified in your environment. Configure recommendations, showing that you've detected content that could be perceived as sensitive and recommend a label that maybe includes encryption to further protect that, or access restrictions. Also starting to use labeling within your scanner, being able to pick and choose repositories and say, hey, anything in this network location or anything on this SharePoint site, we want to make sure we apply a label to it because it's designated as somewhere that hosts sensitive content. Taking those initial actions. Start looking at labeling within Microsoft Cloud App Security. Take a look at what applications, what third-party apps you've integrated, and start that integration process into the CASB solution, Microsoft Cloud App Security. What you gain from this stage is you're a little bit more proactive. You're preventing that leakage of data, whether it was accidentally shared or it was someone pulling that out of the environment and with USB keys and such. So you're preventing that accidental sharing. You're preventing non-compliance with protected regulations, and you're protecting against the loss of your data due to ignorance of those regulations because you have the mechanisms in place. Little bit more impact than before, but still very minimally impactful. It's mostly manual user-driven actions at this point, with the encouragement based on data types that you've selected. So kind of that run phase, the last stage you want to be at that is forward-looking. It's getting reports. It's the automation components here. So what you're really doing in this stage is enabling that full automation, whether it's on the client itself, you're detecting and preventing data in certain locations. Maybe you trust OneDrive and that's an appropriate location, but you want to prevent people from copying that content to their personal Box account. Having those types of controls and mechanisms in place. It's applying automatic encryption with the scanner process based on content type. And then even further, a little bit more advanced is leveraging trainable classifiers. So that was a newer item that was introduced into our labeling component. So you can start training classifiers to use AI and machine learning to help enhance that capability and tailor it to your environment. So this is giving you that largest level protection. It's giving that most forward-looking implementation in your environment and preventing accidental sharing while still enabling people to have their normal workflows, but keep data in locations and shared amongst those that should have access to it. So with that, I thought let's hop out here for a minute and let's go take a look at what all of this means and kind of where you can start. And so for the rest of this discussion, I want to focus predominantly on most of our customers have Microsoft A3 licensing these days or greater. I kind of want to focus on the basics here. If there's a couple things that do touch in the A5 licensing category, I'll try to call it out specifically, just so that you know kind of where that line's drawn a little bit. But for the most part, I want to try to stay with A3 or less to just show you the basic capability and where to start. So hopefully this is a familiar screen to everyone. This is the standard Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And I'm going to hop down. We've got our Compliance Admin Center here, and that's what gets us to this screen. So once we're in the Compliance Admin Center, I'm going to start off with our data classification. Now, this is where we can go create all of our sensitive info types. If we go into this category, we're going to see a big long list of predefined classification types. You can see them, they're all from publisher Microsoft. This is social security numbers, tax ID numbers, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers. It's all the default sensitive info types that we provide. There's I don't remember the exact number, but there's plenty of them here for you to pick and choose from. But you can also create your own. So to create your own, just click the Create Sensitive Info Type section here. And that's going to pop up. And we can give it a hours, we'll just call it Security Office Hours Demo. You give it a nice, nice name and description real quick. And we can go create patterns. So from here, we can start looking at what sensitive info types are important to us. And we can designate, all right, are we building this for high confidence or medium or low confidence? And you can have different patterns that meet different criteria here. So for low confidence, maybe we start with a primary element. You can use regular expressions, just regex, build out pattern matching for your data. So maybe if it's something unique to your environment, whether maybe it's some sort of research identifier or medical record number that follows a pattern, you can certainly use that that regular expression component to build that out and identify those. Simple keyword list and keyword dictionary, they're pretty similar. Keyword list is just kind of a small item, so it's limited to 50 characters, whereas a keyword dictionary is built out a little bit more. Cancel that. So keyword dictionary, this is built out a little further. So it's a larger list you can import from CSV of content you have. The restrictions here are you have about 50 or so of these in, keyword dictionaries per tenant. And it would give you about, I believe it's 1 million or so characters. So it's a little bit of doing something like exact data match, but probably won't work at the scale of exact data match that you might see for importing full databases. We have a solution for exact data match. I wasn't planning to jump into that today, but the keyword dictionaries are a smaller category you can leverage, even with the standard licensing that most of our customers have. So keyword dictionary, you might use this. Our K-12 environments have used this a lot for offensive words and being able to identify different variations of that and detect and respond and block some of that content. Or it could be specific words associated to a confidential project or like code names, etc. It could be medical record numbers if you wanted to put that in here. But again, for that kind of scale, you're probably going to want the full exact data match solution that does up to 1 million rows and has a full schema associated to it. But again, you have keyword dictionaries as one of your options. And then lastly, we also have functions. So when you go into functions, you're going to see a lot of similar things that you would think are associated to our other predefined sensitive info types like credit card numbers and social security numbers. And these are functions that might comprise that. So where this comes in handy is things like US date or US address. You might mix and match those with social security number designations or other sensitive info, maybe student IDs in your environment that might be important to you. So you can leverage that, whether it's a primary element. So if we wanted to, a common way to do this would be, let's look at a high confidence pattern. We're going to do primary element. We'll just use a list here. We're not going to pick a whole lot, and we'll just call it student ID as our designator. So anytime we see student ID, that's going to pop up with as a sensitive info type we're protecting. So you can add other groups as necessary. Oh, I need a name, that's why. Keyword demo. So from here, we can have supporting elements. So as you're building higher confidence patterns, you're going to introduce things for supporting elements. So in this case, we're looking at character proximity. So maybe we want to detect that element within 300 characters of another supporting element. And so this is a great area where those functions come in. And so that supporting element could be, let's pick US date. And so now when we have a student ID near a date, that will increase the confidence that that is a true result. So these are items you're probably going to be diving in and customizing a little bit more as you get into that walk and run phase and are trying to tailor this down a little bit more specifically, reduce false positives, and make sure that you are identifying and protecting the content that's most important to you. So we can go ahead and click create, and we've got a pattern set up as our sensitive info type. So now we can go next. In this case, we've got it set for a high confidence level for that pattern, and we can click create. And we've got a brand new custom sensitive information type in your environment, another tool in the tool chest. So now that you have that data, let's go apply it somewhere. So really, this is just creating what is that important information that you're trying to protect in your environment, creating the identifier for that, and we need to go take that and apply it. So we'll grab our data loss prevention policy here to start with, and we'll go ahead and click create policy, and we'll get started. It's going to show us a couple templates. You can certainly use these templates to start off. You can customize them as you want. We can kind of filter them by regions of what's important to you. So we'll grab US, and let's grab privacy. And so maybe PII, US PII data is what's important to us today. You can, of course, start from scratch and go to custom, but we'll grab US PII and start with that. Let's rename this. We'll call it Security Office Hours Demo for today. And we'll give it a quick description. And so we'll go next to our policy. This is where you get to select where this policy applies. So whether this data loss prevention policy is going to target Exchange or SharePoint and OneDrive, or Teams chat and channel messages. So calling that out, Teams chat and channel messages, that is part of the A5 component. Actually, really the rest of these are here. So that would be the higher licensing tier for that. But we'll focus on Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive for today, and we'll target some of these in the future. I think devices would be a great opportunity for another session down the road. But we'll target Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint for today. Now you can keep those same sensitive info types that it's selected from that template, but let's go and customize that template and pick some of the ones that might be important to us. Maybe we want to add to it, or just maybe rip and replace with other sensitive info types. So I'm going to go expand our template here, and let's go ahead and edit the low confidence section. And so we've got our rule as it exists today. It's got tax ID numbers and social security numbers and passport numbers. But let's say I want to add additional sensitive info types. Now I've pre-created a couple other sensitive info types, one of which is going to be our student identification numbers. So this is more of an exact data match scenario or keyword dictionary scenario. I'll grab another. We'll grab a medical record numbers. And so we can add in those sensitive information types you've created, and you can select the confidence level you want to target, instance counts, etc. And so in this case, we've selected any of these sensitive info types will trigger this rule. From there, you can mix and match. Do you want it, if it's identified as one of those info types and also shared with people outside the organization, then you might want to trigger it. If it's something a little bit more sensitive, you just want to block it altogether, maybe you wouldn't have an additional trigger there. Of course, you can have your exemptions for what you don't want to have this rule process against. And then we can create our actions. So what happens when this rule is triggered? So in this case, maybe we want to either block everyone or restrict access. So encrypt, restrict access to this content when it is identified. You can scroll down here. We get a little bit of our user notifications. If you want to allow those pop-ups, those policy tips are down here. So this is what's giving the end users the education that, hey, something I did is triggering a policy. In the future, this could be impactful. So this is where you can start giving them tips. on the information that they're about to share as you begin to deploy it. So with that rule, we can go back and ultimately you can turn the policy on. It'll default to testing it out first. You can choose to show policy tips while you're still testing it. This is a great feature just to make sure that it is behaving the way you want. You can turn it on entirely if you really have the confidence. I'd recommend going through the testing steps first. Or if it's a policy you just want to turn off for now, maybe you have a different one you're working with, you can of course turn it off and it'll be saved there for your enablement later. So I'm just going to cancel this one for now. And what that looks like, it's something most people here are probably familiar with, but what this looks like from the end user perspective, going from email, let's just create a new message. We're going to send this to our friend Megan here. And please add these student IDs to the student information system. Student ID will call. I'm just going to put a couple in there that I've added. A couple random made up student IDs. And you notice at the top, this policy tip came up. So it says, hey, this email message conflicts with the policy in your organization. We can go to show details and we can see that there's sensitive info here. If we want to overwrite it, I've allowed the end user to overwrite it at this stage. You can certainly not allow that. You can enforce the restriction, but in this instance, we can choose to overwrite it. You can provide a business justification where it's auditable and traceable, or they could be reporting a false positive too. Maybe this doesn't contain sensitive information and they can overwrite it that way and get that message out. So that's just raw content in an email message. Discard that. We've got a couple items here I wanted to show you. We're on our local C drive in the temp folder, and we've got a document file here that includes a number of student IDs. And so we can take this document file. Let's go back to our email client. We're going to browse this computer, grab from our C drive here. We're going to grab this file that has student information in it. And already, just as we've attached that file, we see that same tip here. Now, as you if you overwrite it with justification, if you try to send it on its own, you can have it block that content or encrypt where appropriate, or block when going external, but allow for internal, etc. Same thing also works, of course, with PDFs too. That's kind of one of the other common ones that we get asked is, does this work in PDFs? And so I'll just show you that same example. We've got our student file here with the PDF and our policy tip that says, hey, that's not allowed. So we can go try to send it and we'll get kicked back that this action was blocked.
Hey, Sam.
Yes, sir.
We have a few questions in the chat here, and we can either save them till you're done, or I'll let it, or if you want to cover them now.
Let's go ahead and cover it now.
Okay. The first question was, which I think I just answered there, is the Microsoft 365 compliance menu only viewable to admins, referring to the RBAC roles for the M365 Compliance Center.
Yeah, so normal end users are not going to have access to the Compliance Center. You would have to be an administrator in some capacity. There are scoped roles to allow you just the compliance admin capability.
Perfect. The next question was, I have an HR form with a 9-digit number that gets flagged as a social security number. How do I put in the exception for the specific 9-digit number? So exceptions for getting social security numbers actually mapped as opposed to other 9-digit numbers.
Yeah, and Corey, if you read at the bottom, it's a blank form triggers the rule. Sam, could you talk about document fingerprinting for blank forms?
So I think one of the solutions for that specific concern where you've got blank form, maybe a sample number that keeps getting flagged as sensitive info type, you could use just the standard keyword list there and use the exception rule and say, put in that form number or the sample social security number from that form, use that as a sensitive info type of itself, but an exception for that sensitive info type. That might be a viable solution in that scenario.
Yep, and I believe that was, yeah, so far I think that's pretty much, yeah. Oh, no, one last question. Can you require approval before sending in a workflow? Which I believe you covered earlier, but
Yep, absolutely. So you can send notifications on basically to admins or different approvers for allowing that content. So yeah, you can integrate workflows.
perfect.
And actually, that was perfect timing. I was just looking back at my notifications here. So I had sent that message anyway, even though it was against our policy. And so you can see here that was blocked from being sent. So that's data loss prevention, just kind of at its core level. Same thing with OneDrive and SharePoint, sharing content out that are associated with those file types. Now, the next step I wanted to talk about was using those sensitive info types that we created in our data classification section. And let's go down to our information protection. How do we protect those files at the file level? And how do we identify sensitive content on the files themselves during creation, or identify maybe OneDrive repositories or SharePoint repositories or on-prem repositories that might have some of that sensitive data? So information protection, or Azure information protection, you hear us talk about it frequently. It's comprised of labels and label policies. The labels are what get associated to that document or that item. The policies are what labels you're publishing to different groups of users. So to start off here, we can create a label. I've pre-done a handful of them, but let's say we want to create a we'll just create a general to label because I already have a general, but we'll just create a general label that you might want to publish to your users. You can give them descriptions and get creative with that as necessary. But we can go ahead and click next. And here we can define the scope for this label, whether it's just really for files and emails. If you want to include that for groups and sites, this is allowing it for SharePoint and Teams to use those same labels and that classifications in those environments. And then actually, I think I just saw a question pop up for SQL Server databases and scans. Kind of coming off on that. I wasn't planning to touch on it today, but Azure Purview is in preview. This is allowing that label and classification to integrate into other Azure assets and environments, including SQL columns, to be able to provide that protection in the Azure environments too. So this is the scope of the label for what we're creating. In this case, we're just creating that general label. We'll go ahead, hit next. From here, you can choose what you want to do when this label is selected. A general label, you're probably not encrypting or marking the files, but I'm going to select it just so you can kind of see what the configuration looks like. So if you want to encrypt those files or emails, you can check that. If you want to do content marking, that's the watermarks on your files, you can go through the content marking component. From next, now we can choose, all right, if that file, what encryption we want to do. So if we want to configure encryption settings, so anytime this label's selected, you can either choose to allow the user to assign permissions as they see fit. That's the let users assign permissions when they apply the label. Or you can do assign permissions now and take that control out of the end user perspective and actually assign explicit permissions. You can give expiration to that content and that user access. as well as designating how long that content can be accessed when it's offline. So perfect example, maybe you pick 7 days for offline access. Perfect example would be you have a file, it's got sensitive information on it. It's been sent to a coworker who has legitimate access to that file, but they maybe are offline. They're on an airplane or just in a location where they're not connected to the internet at that point. This is what designates how long they'll be able to access that file without having to re-authenticate to prove that they still have access to it. So it could be never, it could be a day, it could be however many days you want it to be, but that is configurable. You can also go and select the permissions on who should have access to this. So you can grab the permission level. You can select whether they're co-authors or viewers or reviewers, or even create their own custom permissions levels on what you want a certain group of people to do. And so we can create that permissions level and assign users, groups. You can leave it a larger scale for all users in your org, or you can add specific users or email addresses and domains. So real custom, you can customize the level of permissions for every sensitivity type that you've got set up here. From here, let's just go next. I guess would I go back, take the encryption off since we got past that one. So next one's content marking. This is where it allows you to create the watermarks. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But this allows you to create watermarks and headers and footers. You can change font sizes for how in your face you want to be with that. You can change colors due to severity and layouts of that font, that text. But I'll show you exactly what that looks like in a second. Just do test. So we'll go next. Now, auto labeling for files and emails. This is where if you want to perform automatic application of that label. So this gets into that A5 category. So when you're taking that automatic application of a label based on a sensitivity type, that is the Azure Information Protection P2. So I just wanted to call that out real quick. But this is how you would turn on auto labeling for files. For this example, I'm going to leave that off for now. Group sites. This is designating when you have this label associated, if you want to configure different privacy levels for your team or SharePoint site. So when it's a general team, that might be public. If it was a confidential team, you might want it to be private so that only those team members could access that content. It allows you to change external access policies too. Azure Purview. I wasn't planning on going into this, but here's how you can enable auto labeling for things like database columns inside Azure. I think that'll probably be saved for another day. But for creating our label here, we'll just go ahead, do finish and create our label. And now that we've created a label, it's not actually published to anyone or anywhere. To publish that, we use our label policies. The label policies, you can just go ahead and click Publish Label. We can choose the sensitivity labels we want to publish. We can just grab a few here, general, confidential, student, medical maybe, or a couple common ones. Here's that general 2 we just created, and we can go ahead and click Add. And so now we're going to publish these 5 labels to a specific group of users. And so it could be all, you can publish it to everyone in your organization, or we can pop down and grab down to maybe we only want to publish this to Brock. So really anywhere between individual person, groups of people to everyone. You can pick and choose the scope of that. So from there, we can have a couple other settings we want to enable for this user, for Brock in this case. We have a default label. Getting a label on your documents without maybe taking any action gives you that classification on a document that you can later go change. It gives you more insights into that file to be able to make changes where maybe if there was a data leak that was associated to it later and you identified, hey, we need to be a little bit more strict, you can retroactively pull permissions to that file once it has a label on it. So being able to apply a default label can be very beneficial in that regards. You also have options for requiring justification to remove or lower a classification label. So if something is identified as having student IDs in it and the end user tries to remove that label, you can allow them to do it, but it's going to require a business justification, or you can just block them from doing that. You can give them, you can require them to use labels on everything. You can also send them to a custom help desk page as needed too. And then you also have the default labels to sites that you might be deploying. But for your initial kind of walk phase, you're probably not going to be applying default labels. That would be later on, bigger picture. So next, you can give your policy name, demo policy, and description as appropriate, and go ahead and submit that. And that's going to create a policy, in this case, just to Brock, to publish these labels to him. But I'm actually going to hop back out. Let's see what that looks like as the end user. So as an end user, let's go open up Word. We'll just create a brand new one. And this is a sample document with no information. So sample document, no sense of information here. We can see we have the sensitivity drop down here on the toolbar. We can drop that down and we can see those same labels we had just published. So general, confidential, student data, medical data. So for general, maybe just normal content, it doesn't have any encryption applied. We've got our description we set up to help the end user know when they should apply this. But as we apply that general label, we can see we've taken minimal action here. There's no real restrictions. We put a little watermark. You probably, in real world, you probably aren't going to put a watermark for your general, but I wanted to show it for the purposes of this demo. But the file is labeled, it's categorized. It may not have a lot of restrictions. You're still able to share it, but you've at least categorized that content as general general use content in your environment, no sensitive information there. Now, as you want to take that maybe a little further, we'll add, maybe it isn't sensitive information, but we'll say we'll have confidential information. So maybe we want to get a little bit more protective. We want to start applying encryption, but it's not PII. It's not things that are considered student data or medical data. So our sensitivity label, we've selected confidential. In this case, this is the user-driven permissioning. So as the end user, the author of this document, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to have a co-author, and let's go grab Megan B. And we're going to grab Megan. She gets co-author permissions. And you know what, I'm going to expire this access. So after a week, if she hasn't reviewed it, we're going to move forward. So we'll expire it on April 22nd here. And so we can apply these permissions to this file. So now this file we've changed the watermark. Again, this is all customizable and optional as you see fit, but we've now imposed additional restrictions. So this file is protected, it's encrypted, and only Megan and myself have access to it. And Megan is considered a co-author with the appropriate permissions. Now let's start from scratch. Those are all items you can do with pretty standard licensing. You can even have policy tips and encourage people to apply labels in certain scenarios. What I want to show you here is the automatic capability. So this is the Azure Information Protection P2 advanced components doing that automatic data recognition and classification. It takes that choice out of the end user to be able to do this. So for this, maybe we want to please add these records to the database. And I'm going to put a couple student IDs again. Just grab a medical record number, very simple component here. And as we go save this file, I'm going to do save as, and I'm specifically going to select even a location that's not cloud-based. So I'm just going to grab my C drive here, grab a temp directory. This is, we'll just call it demo file. This is not synced to OneDrive. There's no ties to cloud repositories here. This is all action taken from the sensitivity labels and Azure Information Protection components of the Office applications. So as I save this file, you notice automatically we found that this document had medical PHI, and we applied the medical data encrypted label because we detected that, and now it's protected. We can go view the permission. In this case, I still have view, edit, copy, print, but these are predefined, pre-designated on who has access from when that label and that policy was created. But ultimately, that's what's protecting your content there. So I think with that, we only have 8 minutes left. Maybe we stop the recording and kind of open up the mic to anyone who might have questions or want to bring in their own insight or comments.